Hello. This lecture is on the characteristics of Egyptian civilization. Egypt has been called a gift of the Nile, and I think you can see that through these images. This is a satellite map of Egypt. The Nile is a river that flows from south to north. As you can see, there's lots of desert here and all around. The really green parts are along the river, and especially here along the Nile Delta. And you can also get a sense in this scene, there's lots of green here, close to the river. Not so much here. So the Nile River was particularly important. Like the Tigris and Euphrates, it would flood, and its floodwaters would deposit silt that was rich in nutrients that plants needed. So the Nile would bring the water and the nutrients needed to make the land around it fertile. So you can see here a trend that we've had so far, and that's that people like to build cities and civilizations along rivers for reasons we have discussed. You need water if you're going to have cities, if you're going to have domesticated animals, if you're going to have crops, and so forth. And what's really interesting about the Nile is it is a predictable river in terms of flooding. Unlike the Tigris and Euphrates, which seemed to flood whenever they wanted to, the Nile flooded at a regular time, and usually at about a regular distance, like people knew about how far it would flood. So you could plan accordingly. You knew where to build your house. It was much easier to deal with dams and levees and things like that. It's also interesting, whereas the Mesopotamians tended to view the gods as rather capricious and angry all the time, the Egyptians seem to have viewed the gods in a more benevolent way. Right? They saw the gods as more friendly to human beings, and some of this seems to have to have done with their natural environment. But what all this means is that farming was relatively easy and highly productive. So that's great for Egypt. They're able to grow a lot of food without necessarily putting in as much effort as might have to be done in other places. In addition, Egypt, because of the desert surrounding the Nile, is able to have some protection from foreign invaders, right? It's not easy just to go in and invade Egypt. And I think early on, especially, this gave Egypt a lot of time to kind of develop its civilization and to strengthen itself. But the key thing is, if you are getting a lot of resources from easy farming, then that means you have a lot of food, so you can have people specialize in things, and you're not spending as much time and energy farming. That gives you lots of time to develop your civilization. So the Egyptians are going to develop a highly advanced civilization and make a lot of developments, particularly in terms of engineering and religion. Now, this is an early Egyptian pyramid, and when you think Egypt, you tend to think pyramids. It's similar to a ziggurat. It's a step pyramid made of bricks, so quite a bit easier to make than some of the other Egyptian pyramids. Incidentally, this is a picture I took myself. That's me there. This is taken from a moving bus, and that's my reflection. So this is a fairly simple pyramid, but the Egyptians would develop things that were even more impressive over time, right? They managed to build the Sphinx, which, I mean, it's been kind of eroded by the wind, but it's still pretty darn impressive. And gigantic pyramids like this, made with stones that I think each weighed something like 2.5 tons. That's my father. He's the one that basically he said, I need someone, I want to go on a trip to the Holy Land. Egypt's on the way, so we'll stop there. I need someone to carry my stuff, basically. I'll pay for you if you do that for me. And I said, okay. So I went with my father, and I was his pack mule. But he paid the way, so it was just fine. And we had a good time together. But that's a picture of him there. So Egyptian engineering is going to develop, and it's often connected to religion, which in turn helps to build a stable social order. I'm going to start talking about that now. So it's kind of tricky because the Egyptians didn't always refer to their rulers as such, but we're just going to use that term to make things simpler. But the Egyptian ruler was called a pharaoh, and it's complex theologically, but it was believed that the pharaoh was kind of had a special relationship with the god and was kind of like a god or would become a god later on. I mean, Egyptian history lasts thousands of years. Their ideas changed. For now, that's enough for us, that the pharaoh either has a special relationship with the gods or was himself a god or herself. There were some female pharaohs. We'll look at one. And the pharaoh had the job, similar to a Mesopotamian king, of maintaining order in this world and also as acting as an intermediary with the gods. Now, that second role was shared with the priests of Egypt, but the Egyptian pharaoh was also expected to perform various religious rituals and had a religious role. And the pharaohs, in part because they had access to all those wonderful resources and all that food from the farming that was made easy by the Nile, they had enough power and wealth to engage in massive building projects. Right? They could build things like the pyramids that were huge. And these impressive structures would naturally reinforce the sense of the pharaoh's divinity. So you can kind of think about it this way. If you're an Egyptian peasant, you probably live in a house that is one story. It's maybe 10 to 12 feet tall, depending on the size of the roof. It's not terribly big. And the pyramids are like hundreds of feet tall. And I remember when we were in a bus. A bus was taking us to go see the pyramids, and we could see them. And I was like, "Oh, great! We're gonna be there soon." And the bus just kept going and going and going, and we weren't there because the things were so big. We could see them for miles away. And we're modern people, and we're still impressed by these things. Think about people in this time period. So if you're just your average Egyptian, you look at that and you say, wow, the pharaoh really is a god, or at least has a close relationship with a god. Otherwise, how could he have something like that built? And if you think of God just as something that's really, really powerful, yeah, the pharaoh kind of is a god, right? He's that powerful. He can have something like that built. So there's a sense that for Egyptian people, that there's something right about their government. Cosmically right. As we talked about with Mesopotamia, there's this idea that, yeah, there's something right about our pharaoh ruling. Clearly, this person is like a god, someone who's very powerful. So we should accept the pharaoh's right to rule. And I think this also gave Egyptian people, and it still gives Egyptian people to this day, a sense of pride in their civilization. Look at what we can do. Again, this is difficult history. I should point out oftentimes people think of the pyramids being built by Hebrews who were enslaved by the Egyptians. It is true that there were Hebrews that were enslaved by the Egyptians, but they did not build the pyramids. The Bible never says that. It says they built treasure houses, which are different. A lot of the times, the people who built this were free laborers and paying their tax to the government or else hired by the government. And I think just like anyone who's built something, they could feel a sense of pride in what they had done. Right? So you can think about it this way. You're an Egyptian. You help build this amazing structure for your great pharaoh. It makes you feel there's something good about your civilization. It gives you pride in being an Egyptian. What does that do? Well, it encourages you to be obedient to the state, which is great for social order, right? Pay your taxes, do your labor. Okay, yeah, it makes sense to. Of course I'm going to do what my government tells me to. The pharaoh's in charge. He's like a god. Look at those pyramids. This also gives a kind of feeling of national unity. Egyptians share this pride in their civilization and are willing to work for their state to protect that civilization and make it better. And that's key because it means when there's a crisis, when there's problems, people are willing to sacrifice for the good of the nation. You don't sacrifice for something you're not proud of. No one's going to put their life on the line for someone who they don't respect or for a government they don't care about or they feel is disconnected from them. But if you feel proud of your government, if you feel proud of your civilization, you're more willing to sacrifice to work hard for it. And this kind of structure that connected the pharaoh and Egyptian civilization to religion, that gave people a sense that what they were doing was right in a cosmic universal sense, that gave them that kind of strong identity and willingness to sacrifice. And that's one reason why Egypt will be such a long-lasting and successful civilization. And I want to stress that in all of this, Egyptians had a very strong understanding of the afterlife. We'll go more into detail about this later. But in the afterlife, you were judged. according to your actions. Now, there's a video clip you'll watch that shows that it's a little bit more complex than that. But basically, if you were good, and the way they determined whether you were good or not was that Anubis would weigh your heart, which was kept in a little vase. This is after you die, of course, against the feather of justice. And if your heart was lighter than the feather of justice, meaning you didn't have sins weighing you down, you got to have a nice, happy afterlife. If you did not, if your heart was heavier than the feather of justice, then this creature got to devour you. It has the body or the torso of a lion, the head of a crocodile, and the hindquarters of a hippo. And this terrible creature would literally eat your soul and you'd be annihilated. So naturally, this kind of encouraged you to be good. So not only did the religion help to encourage social order in Egypt by, the building of pyramids and things like that in honor of the god pharaohs, but also there was notions of an afterlife in which you were punished or rewarded based on being good. Just as a quick aside, one thing that is kind of a curious fact about Egypt, and it reminds me because he's got the hindquarters of a hippo, multiple Egyptian pharaohs were killed while hunting hippopotami. Right? Hippopotami, I think that's the plural for hippopotamus, can be very dangerous. So mind that if you're an Egyptian pharaoh, stay away from the hippopotami. So to give you concrete evidence of what I mean, right, when I say that Egypt was a successful civilization that was held together in a part by this connection between religion, engineering, and the pride that led to, I'm going to give you a very broad overview of Egyptian chronology. Now, I don't expect you to remember all these years, but I do expect you to remember some facts about the years. So first of all, Egypt, its first period of union we call the Old Kingdom, which lasted nearly 500 years. That's really good. And then it fell apart for about 100 years. That's called the First Intermediate Period. But, you're unified for 500 years almost. You fall apart for 100 years. Then you get a new kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, which lasted about 450 years. That's pretty good. Falls apart. We have another intermediate period. This one lasts a little bit over 100 years. And then we get the New Kingdom, which lasts almost 500 years. So my point is this, right? Egypt often did fall apart, but it would put itself back together again. Egyptians had such a strong sense of identity, encouraged by their religion, their culture, all those things are all connected together, that even though things would fall apart, they would try and put them back together again. When Egypt was divided, it felt like something was wrong. There's something wrong in the world if Egypt is not unified, so we need to unify it. Now, briefly, why did it fall? We'll talk more about this with the New Kingdom, but usually it was a combination of domestic problems and or foreign invasions. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the fall of the New Kingdom. But the key thing I want to stress is that these Egyptian kingdoms lasted a long time. When they fell apart, they would be put back together again because of the strong sense of a civilization undergirded by engineering and religion. And what's really striking is that later, even though Egyptians would be conquered by other people and be ruled by non-Egyptians, this happened a lot. So, for example, I believe Cleopatra, and you may know her as the most famous female pharaoh, she was Greek, at least by lineage, right? She was from a Greek family. They had been in Egypt for a long time, so they, I believe, adopted many Egyptian cultural aspects, but she was Greek, ethnically speaking. So, but Egypt did not lose its identity, and there's still people who call themselves Egyptians and are proud of their heritage. And like I said, we can see here the importance of identity and religion in maintaining the Egyptian civilization. Even when they lost their government and were ruled by foreigners, they still stayed Egyptians.